She showed up to my father's funeral wearing his jacket, and I want to be honest that the first thing I felt when I saw her wasn't grief or confusion or even the mild social alarm of seeing a stranger in a dead man's clothing. It was recognition, the specific kind that arrives before understanding, the way your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I was standing at the entrance to the church greeting people I mostly didn't know, doing the particular performance of composed grieving that funerals require from the family, and she came through the door in a brown corduroy jacket with a small tear at the left pocket that I had watched my father sew up himself with mismatched thread on a Sunday afternoon 3 years ago, and I stopped mid-handshake with whoever I'd been talking to and just stared. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back with a few loose strands, the careful, composed expression of someone who knows they are about to do something difficult and has been preparing for it for days, possibly weeks. She looked at me across the church foyer with a steadiness that told me she had known this moment would be strange and had decided to do it anyway. And then she said quietly before I had asked anything, "He told me to find you. He said you'd know the jacket." I had no idea. Standing in my father's church in my father's town among people I'd grown up beside, that the woman in the corduroy jacket was about to tell me things about the last 2 years of my father's life that I didn't know existed, and that what she told me was going to change how I understood not just him, but myself. Let me take you back to the week before the funeral, because what happened at the church doesn't make full sense without understanding what our relationship had actually been, my father's and mine, and how much of it had existed in the space between what we said and what we meant. My name is Eli. I'm 33 years old, and I grew up in a small town 4 hours from the city where I now live and work as an architect. My father was a high school history teacher named Robert, who spent 40 years in the same classroom in the same building, teaching the same wars and the same revolutions to successive generations of students who were mostly indifferent to the material and occasionally, in the way of good teachers, genuinely transformed by it. He was a methodical private man with strong opinions about most things and a consistent inability to express any of them emotionally, which is a combination I inherited wholesale and spent my early 30s slowly learning to recognize in myself. We loved each other with the specific difficulty of people who are too similar to communicate easily, which meant our relationship existed mainly in practical exchanges, phone calls about logistics, visits at holidays, the particular warmth of being in the same room without needing to perform closeness we didn't know how to produce. I thought I understood him. I thought I knew the shape of his life. I was wrong in ways I didn't discover until a stranger walked into his funeral in his jacket and said she'd been sent to find me. He died on a Tuesday in March. Quickly, a cardiac event the doctor described with clinical efficiency as massive and unsurvivable, which is the kind of language that closes down further questions, not because the questions aren't valid, but because the answers don't change anything. He was 67. He had seemed, the last time I'd seen him 3 months earlier at Christmas, entirely like himself. A little slower, maybe. The specific slowing of a man in his late 60s who has spent 40 years standing in classrooms and has decided the pace of the rest of his life should reflect that tenure. We had eaten dinner and watched a film and talked about a book he'd been reading, and I had driven back to the city feeling the specific low-grade guilt of a person who knows they don't visit enough and intends to remedy this and then doesn't. And then he died on a Tuesday in March, and I drove the 4 hours back through the kind of gray early spring, weather that seems designed to make grief feel even more physical than it already does. I want to be specific about what our relationship actually was, because the rest of this story depends on understanding it honestly rather than retrospectively. My father and I spoke on the phone every 2 or 3 weeks. Calls that lasted approximately 20 minutes and covered a regular circuit of topics. His students, my projects, the weather in his town and the weather in my city, books we had both been reading or intended to read, and occasionally the particular low-stakes sports opinions that men of certain generations use as a vehicle for the warmth they struggle to produce directly. These calls were comfortable. They were also, I understand now, a container that held a fraction of what either of us was actually thinking about when we weren't on the phone. We saw each other at Christmas and occasionally in summer, and those visits had the same quality as the calls: comfortable, genuine, and organized around the subjects we both knew how to discuss, rather than the ones we both knew existed but hadn't found a format for. He was proud of me. I knew this in the abstract, the way you know things people demonstrate through action rather than statement. He had never, in my memory, told me directly. I had never told him directly either, which made us even in a way that was not. In fact, even at all, the funeral homework, the arrangements, the notifications, I did all of it with the particular efficiency of someone whose grief hasn't caught up to the practical requirements of the situation yet. I sorted through the house, which was a process I had anticipated would be straightforward, and which turned out to be not straightforward at all, because the house of a methodical private man is full of the evidence of a life organized according to principles you didn't know he had. There were boxes of student papers going back 20 years, kept in a system I couldn't parse. There were letters from people I didn't know. There were photographs from before my mother, who had left when I was 8, and photographs from after, and an entire shelf of books with his handwriting, in the margins in a way that made it feel like finding a second person living. Inside the first one, I found things in those days that I had not expected to find, not in any dramatic sense. No secrets or revelations of the kind that change the fundamental understanding of a person, but in the quieter sense of discovering the specific texture of a life you hadn't been paying close enough attention to. The community garden plot was one discovery. I found the permit in a kitchen drawer, 4 years of renewals clipped together with a paperclip. I found a small notebook of growing notes, dates of planting, observations about soil conditions, a small sketch of the plot's layout that had been revised several times as he rearranged what grew where. I found a list of names and years, students he had taught, written in the back of a notebook with a single word beside each one: architect, historian, doctor, teacher, with no other annotation, just the record of where they'd gone. He had been paying attention in ways he had never described to me, and the evidence of it, found in drawers and shelves and careful notes, produced a grief that was different from the simple grief of loss. It was the grief of distance, the specific ache of realizing how much of a person existed outside the portion they showed you. I was in the middle of this when the woman in the corduroy jacket walked into the church. Her name was Marin. She had met my father 18 months earlier at a community garden 2 blocks from his house, where he had apparently been maintaining a plot for the past 4 years, something I had not known or had not retained if he had told me. She was one of the garden's organizers, a landscape illustrator by profession, and she described their first meeting with a specificity that told me she had thought about how to tell this story before she arrived. He had been incorrectly watering something. She had told him so with the directness of someone who cared more about the plants than the social awkwardness of correcting a stranger, and he had, instead of bristling, looked at her for a moment and said, "Show me." That, she said, was the beginning of a friendship that had lasted until 3 weeks before he died. I want to be clear about what she described, because I think it matters. What my father had built with Marin over those 18 months was not a romantic friendship or a friendship with ambiguous dimensions, but the specific and not especially common thing of 2 people who found each other interesting and built a genuine mutual regard around a shared activity that neither of them was fully good at when they started. She was 32, unmarried, absorbed in work she found meaningful and occasionally maddening. He was 66, widowed. My mother had not died, but had been gone so long she existed in my father's life with the same practical absence, and had apparently reached a point in his life where the garden twice a week was the part he organized the rest of his schedule around, which tells you everything about what it meant to him. They talked. They disagreed. She told me, with a kind of quiet pleasure, that he was the most stubbornly incorrect person about mulching she had ever met, and that he had eventually come around to her position after approximately 8 months of evidence, and had done so without ever quite conceding the argument, which she described as characteristic. We sat in the small room off the church vestibule, the one they use for family before services, and she talked, and I listened with the particular quality of attention that happens when you're hearing about a person you thought you knew well and discovering you knew them partially, which is a disorienting experience I can only describe as the floor of your understanding shifting without breaking. My father had gone to the garden twice a week. He had learned to grow tomatoes and had apparently become, over 4 years, unexpectedly skilled at them, and had given them to his neighbors every August with a diffidence she described as endearing rather than standoffish, which was not a word I had ever associated with him. He had talked to her about his students, many of them, over the years of knowing her, with a warmth and retention that surprised me because I had never quite seen it directed outward. He knew their names, their trajectories, what had happened to them. He had talked to her about me. I found in everything she described a version of my father that was continuous with the one I had known but more complete. The way a photograph becomes a person when you finally see the ones that were taken in the moments you weren't present for. He had gone to the garden because she thought it was the one context in which results were unambiguous. You planted, it grew, or it didn't. And the feedback was honest and immediate in a way that decades of teaching students couldn't always be. He had found, in the specific physical work of tending something, a kind of directness that his professional life required him to defer and his personal life hadn't always made easy. She said all of this without sentimentality, as a simple observation, and I absorbed it as the gift it was. He talked about you often, she said. He was proud of you in a way that he seemed to find difficult to, she paused, choosing the word carefully, transmit. He said you were the best thing he'd done and that he wasn't sure you knew it. I sat with that sentence in the small room off the vestibule and felt it do something that most sentences don't do, which is arrive somewhere structural rather than simply emotional, somewhere that rearranges how you understand the architecture of a thing rather than just how you feel about it. My father had said I was the best thing he'd done. He had said it to a woman in a garden, surrounded by his tomato plants and not to me, because he was a man who found transmission difficult, which is a quality I recognized with a specific terrible clarity because I had inherited it and spent my adult life wrestling with it and still didn't always win. The jacket, I said, because I needed to ask it and couldn't figure out how to make it smaller. She looked down at the corduroy jacket, then back at me. He gave it to me about a month ago, she said. He said, she stopped again, with the careful pause of someone repeating words they've been trusted to repeat accurately. He said he wanted you to have his workshop tools and the books with the margins and that he'd leave instructions for those. And then he said he wanted me to come to the funeral wearing this, because it was the jacket he wore in the garden and he wanted someone there who loved the person he was in the garden, not just the person he was everywhere else. And he said if I wore it, you'd know the jacket, and then I should tell you what I've been telling you. He had planned it. My father, who struggled to say direct emotional things to the people who mattered to him most, had planned a small, elaborate gesture for after his own death that would tell me things he hadn't managed to say while alive, because he knew me well enough to know that I would need to be told obliquely in a form I could absorb slowly, and he had trusted a woman from a community garden with the delivery of this message because she had known him honestly, in a context where he got to be someone growing things rather than someone teaching things, and she had agreed to carry it. I didn't cry in the small room, because I have my father's difficulty with transmission, but I came close, which is something I'm telling you because it seems important to the accuracy of the record. Marin stayed for the service and for the reception afterward, which is a thing she did because she had come a long way and because I think she was also grieving and needed somewhere to put it. I found myself looking for her throughout the reception in the way you look for the one person you've actually talked to. And I found her twice, once near the sandwiches, talking to one of my father's colleagues who had apparently also known about the garden, and once near the door with a cup of tea, standing with the self-contained ease of someone who is comfortable at the edges of things. On the second occasion, I crossed the room and stood beside her, and we talked for a long time about my father, the specific version of him she'd known, and I told her things I knew about him that she didn't. Because the exchange felt mutual in a way that seemed right, Two people who had known him from different angles, constructing together a fuller picture than either of them had separately. There was a specific moment in that reception conversation that I have thought about many times since. I had been telling her about the student papers I'd found, the boxes going back 20 years, the list of names and outcomes in the back of the notebook, and I said I found it unexpected that he hadn't mentioned keeping track in that way, that it suggested a sustained attention I hadn't associated with him. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "He talked about you that way too. He tracked everything. The projects you'd finished, the things you'd learned. He mentioned when you called afterward. I knew when you called." I sat with that for a long moment. He had mentioned to a woman in a garden when his son called. He had kept track, in the same private, non-announced way he'd kept track of everything else, as something too important to perform and too real to discard. That is the kind of love that leaves evidence you don't find until you look in the right drawer. And I am still, honestly, not finished looking. I drove back to the city 2 days after the funeral with my father's tools in the back of my car and his annotated books in a box on the passenger seat and a number in my phone that I had put there. With more deliberateness than the casual exchange of numbers usually involves, on the last afternoon at his house. Marin had been helping me sort through things, she had offered, and I had accepted with more relief than I'd expected to feel. Because sorting through a dead parent's belongings is a task that benefits enormously from having another person present, specifically a person who knew them but wasn't in the immediate family, because they can observe without the same weight and help you see what's actually there rather than what grief is making you see. She was good at this. She was precise and thoughtful and unhurried, and she noticed things I would have overlooked, including, on the last afternoon, a small handwritten note tucked inside the front cover of a gardening book on the kitchen shelf that read, "In my father's handwriting, simply ask Marin," 2 words, no further instruction. I looked at it for a long time. I think he wrote it for me. I think he wrote it knowing I might find it, and knowing that if I did, I would be standing in a house I was sorting through because he was gone, and that Ask Marin would not need further explanation. He was right. It didn't. We had worked through the afternoon, and I had found, among the things in his study, a small journal that I recognized immediately as something I wasn't supposed to find by accident. It was placed too centrally on the desk, in too obvious a position for a man as organized as my father, and when I opened it, I found a single page near the front with my name at the top and 3 sentences below it that I am going to keep between myself and the journal because they belong to me, which is the specific kind of private that I think my father would have understood. I held the journal for a moment, and then I held it for longer. And Marin, who had been sorting books on the other side of the room, registered the silence and looked across at me and didn't say anything and didn't cross the room, which was the exactly right thing to do, and which told me something important about her understanding of when presence and when space are different kinds of help. I sat with the journal for 10 minutes while she continued to work quietly on the other side of the room, and in those 10 minutes I thought about my father with a comprehensiveness I had not managed in the 4 days since his death, because grief had been directing my thinking outward toward arrangements and logistics and other people's needs, and the journal stopped that outward motion entirely. He had written the page with the same neat, deliberate handwriting he had used for everything: lesson plans, grocery lists, the margins of his books, and what he had written was direct in a way our actual conversations had never quite managed to be. I understood, reading it, that he had known he was writing for an audience of one person who would need the message in a form they could absorb slowly, and he had written it in exactly that form. I put the journal in my bag. I will keep it for the rest of my life. We had dinner that night in the one decent restaurant in my father's town, the kind of dinner that happens when 2 people have spent an afternoon doing something emotionally difficult together and need to decompress in company. And we talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing and everything to do with my father, her work, the specific pleasure of illustrating landscapes that already existed versus inventing ones that didn't, the difference between depicting something and interpreting it. I told her about the projects I was currently working on, the particular challenge of residential architecture, The negotiation between what a client asks for and what they actually need, which is a problem, I said, that turns out to be present in most kinds of work that involves other people. She laughed at that with a warmth I hadn't quite heard before, a laugh that was different from the careful attentiveness of the last 2 days, and I found it disarmingly real. I drove home the following morning. We texted intermittently over the following weeks, nothing with any particular agenda, just the continuation of a conversation that had opened up over those 2 days and hadn't found its natural close. She sent me a photograph once of the community garden plot my father had kept, which she'd been tending since his death with the specific care of someone honoring something rather than simply maintaining it. I looked at the photograph for a long time, at the tomato plants in their spring state, and thought about my father in that garden twice a week for 4 years, learning something new and getting good at it and giving the results to his neighbors with a diffidence that someone who loved him had learned to read as generosity rather than reserve. She texted me once, a few weeks after the funeral, just a photograph of the garden plot with no message. I looked at it for a long time, the tomato plants in their late March state, still coming back, still reaching, and I wrote back, "Thank you," which was inadequate but true. She replied with, "It's doing well," and that was the whole exchange. But I put my phone down afterward feeling something I couldn't name exactly, which is not something I experience frequently and which I took as information. We met in the city about 6 weeks after the funeral. She had a professional reason to be there, an illustration commission that required reference visits to a botanical garden, and we had dinner the evening before she drove back. The dinner was at a restaurant I knew and liked, nothing elaborate, the kind of place where you can hear each other and the food is good enough not to distract from the conversation. She arrived in a different jacket, obviously, and I noticed this and registered it as a small relief, even though I understood that the corduroy jacket was somewhere back in her apartment, probably hung on a specific hook with the specific intention of keeping it safe, and that the fact of it was still present even when the thing itself wasn't. I had been thinking about her, in the weeks between the funeral and this dinner, in a way I was aware of but hadn't examined with any precision. She occupied a specific category that didn't have a clear name. She was the person who had known my father honestly in a context I hadn't had access to, and she was the person he had trusted with the last deliberate message of his life. And she was, separately and in her own right, someone I had found unexpectedly interesting to talk to, which are 3 different things and were, during those weeks, somewhat difficult to disentangle. I had told myself I wanted to see her again primarily for the first 2 reasons, because it felt more defensible. Sitting across from her at dinner, I understood that the 3rd reason had always been there alongside the other 2 and was, if anything, the one with the most momentum. We talked about my father again, but differently than in the days immediately after, with more space, more reconstruction, less immediate grief, and more genuine interest in the person he had been and in what he had left behind. She told me things about him I found surprising and things I found entirely unsurprising and a few things that I found so accurate to a version of him I had glimpsed only occasionally that I had to stop and ask her to say them again. She had known him in a way that was different from how I'd known him, but was also, and this is the part I kept returning to, not lesser. It was a different facet of the same person, and having both felt more complete than having mine alone. I walked her to her car at the end of the evening, and we stood on the street for a while doing the particular thing of not quite ending a conversation that neither person wants to end. She had a 4-hour drive. I had a building project with an early meeting. We both knew these things, and were both apparently willing, in the specific mutual way of that particular moment, to treat them as less urgent than they were. She asked me while we were standing there what I was going to do with the tomato plants. I had not thought about this. The community garden plot had been renewed through autumn. Someone would need to tend it or let the renewal lapse. I said I hadn't decided yet, which was true, and she looked at me for a moment with an expression that was partially assessing and partially something else I didn't quite have a word for yet, and said that if I decided to keep it, she could show me what he'd been doing with it, because she knew his methods by then, and it would be a shame to lose 4 years of soil improvement and the specific variety of tomato he'd spent 2 seasons getting right. I said I would think about it, which is the answer I give when I've already made a decision but haven't admitted it to myself yet. When she finally said she should go, she looked at me for a moment with an expression that had something clear in it she hadn't been wearing before, or that I hadn't been looking for before, and she said, "Your father said you were difficult to reach. He meant it kindly. He meant you were worth the effort." I thought about that for the drive back to my apartment and for several days after. And what I thought was that my father had given me two things: the message in the journal, which was mine alone, and this, a woman who had known him honestly and been trusted with a corduroy jacket and a small piece of deliberate orchestration designed to ensure that I would know. Finally, what he had been trying to transmit for 33 years. He had found, in a community garden, a way to say the thing he couldn't say in the room. I called Marin on a Saturday morning 6 weeks later. Not to arrange anything, there was no agenda, but because I wanted to talk to her, which was an uncomplicated impulse that I had for a while been treating as more complicated than it actually was. She answered on the third ring, sounding like she'd been outside, and I could hear faintly what I recognized from her description as the particular ambient sound of a community garden on a weekend morning: voices, a gate, the faint sound of something being watered, and something in that detail made the whole conversation feel easier than the ones that had preceded it. We talked for an hour and a half. At some point, she mentioned the tomato plot, and I told her I'd decided to keep it, and she said she'd thought I might, and neither of us made anything more of that than it needed to be. I asked her to come back to the city the following month. She said yes without hesitation, which is the kind of yes that tells you the answer had been ready for some time. She came back, and she came back again. And at some point, the coming back became the default rather than the arrangement, which is how most permanent things begin. Not with a declared intention, but with a pattern that accumulates its own gravity. I went to the garden with her on a trip back to my father's town in early summer, and she showed me what he'd been doing with his plot the way she'd shown him. Directly, without condescension, with the specific patience of someone who cares about the outcome. I made mistakes and she corrected them, and I learned the particular vocabulary of that small square of earth, which plants needed what, how the drainage worked on the east side versus the west, what my father had been trying to do with the rotation he'd started in his third year. I found, working in the garden in the early summer light with her beside me, that I was thinking about him differently than I had at any point since the church. Not with grief exactly, though grief was still present, but with something that had more room in it, more texture, more of the person I'd been learning about since she walked in wearing his jacket. She was patient in a way I recognized. Eventually, as distinct from the patience of someone waiting for something, it was the patience of someone who has already decided and is simply moving at the pace the situation requires. I understood this about her gradually over the months of that summer and into autumn, in the way you understand things about a person that they don't say directly, but that become clear through the accumulation of how they behave when nothing is at stake. She helped me see my father. She helped me understand things about myself that I had been working toward and hadn't quite reached. She didn't do either of these things intentionally, or at least she never presented them as intentions. She simply showed up, reliably, in the way a person does when they have decided you're worth showing up for. And over the months, it accumulated into something I did not have a clean word for, but recognized completely when I looked directly at it. I told her I loved her 6 months after the funeral, in the garden, which felt right in the way that choosing the right place for a thing always makes the thing itself feel more real. She was standing at my father's plot, which she still tended on the weeks I wasn't there, and I was standing beside her. And it was a September evening with the specific quality of light that September evenings have when the year has started to tip toward autumn but hasn't quite arrived. I had been holding this for a while, weeks, maybe, waiting not for courage but for the right moment, which is not the same thing, and which I have learned, from my father's example, to be careful about waiting for too long. She was deadheading the last of the summer plants, the specific careful work of the end of a season, and I was doing something else nearby. The comfortable silence of two people who have learned each other's company well enough not to need to fill it, and I felt, with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives when you've stopped trying to think something, and it simply becomes obvious, that this was the person. I told her. She was very still for a moment. Then she said she already knew. Then she said she loved me too, and she said it with the particular directness she brought to everything true, without performance and without qualification, which is the only way I've ever wanted to hear it. She did not perform surprise at this. She did not make it dramatic. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, with a directness that I had, over 6 months, come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite. The specific quality of someone who doesn't dilute the things they mean with the things they're supposed to say. My father never met her as someone he knew would love his son. He knew her well, in the way of two people who met twice a week for 18 months over the particular intimacy of shared work. But he never knew she and I would find each other, and I will never be able to tell him we did. What I can do and what I have done is take very good care of the tomato plants he left behind. She taught me how the same way she taught him, with the specific directness of someone who cares more about the thing growing correctly than about the social awkwardness of correction. I made mistakes and she told me so with the same patience she'd shown him, and then I did it correctly, and the plants came back the following summer better than the year before, which is what good tending produces when you give it time. He would have liked that, I think. He would have said so obliquely in a form I would need to absorb slowly, and I would have understood him finally, the way I've learned to understand him since, through the evidence of what he loved, and the people he trusted to carry it forward. I keep the corduroy jacket. Marin gave it to me eventually, a few months after the garden, with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone returning something that was always going to end up in one particular person's hands. It hangs in my front hallway, the small tear at the left pocket still sewn with mismatched thread. His Sunday afternoon repair, the one I watched him make 3 years ago without registering it as something I would one day want to remember. I registered it now. I register everything now, which is the specific gift of loss and love arriving together in a way that rearranges what you notice and what you let pass through unexamined. He would have been pleased about that too, I think. He was a man who paid attention to things, in his private way, and he spent a long time hoping his son would learn to do the same. I am learning. I intend to keep learning. That is the thing he gave me, finally, after everything, through a woman in a garden who agreed to carry his message in a jacket she wore once to a church and then kept carefully until the moment came to pass it on. Not because the message was finished, but because it had arrived where it was always supposed to go. Some things take a long time to find the right hands. I am grateful every day that mine were finally open enough to receive them.